Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, in Edexcel A Level Politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, before looking at some key 12 markers and 30 markers you could be asked about NATO in your exams. I'm then going to give you an introduction to NATO, looking at its origins and original aims, its structure, and NATO today, before looking at the development of NATO over time, including its key role during the Cold War, its expansion and aims following the end of the Cold War and its role in the last 2 decades, before finally finishing off by looking at some debates about NATO, including a central debate about whether it's lost its purpose and a debate about whether it's effective. And the arguments in those will be really, really useful for your essays, your 30-mark essays in the exam. The PDF, the notes you can see on your screen, are part of an updating textbook on global politics for the Edexcel specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website. It's really, really detailed and constantly updated to make sure it's always relevant. And you can also find on the Politics Explained website loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A level, including essay plans covering every single part of the course, updating textbooks covering every single part of the course, a place to sign up for tutoring, and a place to sign up for some live revision webinars we're doing before this year's exams, if that's something you'd be interested in. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So, in terms of the parts of the specification, these notes in this video covers. So this is the second video on global governance, political and economic, and it's the second key political global governance institution. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So we're going to have a look at its role and significance, including its changing role over time, especially since the end of the Cold War, and its strengths and weaknesses. In terms of potential essay questions, you could get asked in the exam. So all of these questions in bold. You could get kind of key ones that I've planned, and you can purchase the essay plans on the Politics Explained website, and they cover the key questions that you can get asked. Of course, you can get asked different questions. I've included a lot of different ones that aren't in bold. If you know the ones in bold really well, you'll be really well prepared. So these cover kind of the whole of topic 2, global governance, political and economic. In terms of ones that include NATO, it's often going to be a comparison, I think, to the United Nations. With NATO in terms of the 12 markers, where the differences, similarities, criticisms, shared criticisms, but you could get it compared to another international institution as well. In terms of those 30 markers, you could bring it in, there could be a general question on the effectiveness of global political governance, but you could also get one just on NATO. So evaluate the view that NATO is now ineffective and outdated, for example, and that's the one I've planned. Yeah, let's start off by having a look at an introduction to NATO. So NATO was founded in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II, and its primary goal was to serve as a collective defence mechanism to counter the growing threat posed by the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War. The signing of NATO in Washington DC laid the foundation for the alliance, and its key principles were based on mutual defence outlined in Article 5, which stated that an armed attack against one member state would be considered an attack against all, and that's really, really important. That's the central feature and the most important thing to understand about NATO, effectively its key purpose and its key principle. And this was really aimed to deter aggression from the Soviet Union, providing a security umbrella to Western European states that were rebuilding after the devastation of World War II. So effectively, Western European states signed it, the United States signed it, and crucially that meant that if a Western European state was attacked by the Soviet Union, that would be treated by all states, including, crucially, the United States, as an attack on itself. And that was really aimed to deter the Soviet Union from attacking any of the member states in Western Europe in particular. So founding members included 12 countries, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom and the United States. And it was formed to provide collective security to Western Europe, encourage political unity and cooperation between Northern American and European nations, and actually facilitate originally the economic rebuilding of Europe in collaboration with the Marshall Plan, which many of you might have done at GCSE. While its primary focus wasn't deterring the Soviet Union from expanding militarily in Europe, it also aimed to prevent the rise of nationalism and militarism in Europe by fostering cooperation and preventing internal conflicts among its member states as well. So, what's the structure of NATO? So, the alliance's central decision-making body is the North Atlantic Council, which consists of representatives from all member states. It's its highest authority, and it makes decisions by consensus, meaning that all member states must agree before action is taken. This being said, the US's military might and its central importance to the alliance means that it holds by far the most sway. decisions. Something is definitely not going to happen if the US doesn't want it to, and if the US wants something to happen, it's probably going to happen. The Secretary General, appointed by member states, serves as a political leader and spokesperson of NATO. They chair meetings of the NAC and other key NATO committees. So currently, Mark Rutte, who was a politician in the Netherlands previously. It relies on contributions from its member states for its military forces, and it doesn't itself have standing armed forces. It's just a cooperative alliance where the militaries of its member states come together and work together, and of course agree to protect each other if one of them is attacked. So it does coordinate kind of contributions from its members and coordinate the action of its militaries, including joint missions and exercises. Today then, so since its formation, it's evolved significantly, both in terms of membership and the scope of its mission. So it was originally a 12-member alliance, as we said. It now includes 31 member countries, with its most recent additions being Finland in 2023 and Sweden in 2024. It's become a central pillar of global security, engaging in various roles beyond its original Cold War purpose of deterring aggression from the Soviet Union. Its modern objectives have expanded to include crisis management, cooperative security, and conflict prevention. We're going to have a look at this in a bit more detail later in the video. So it combats terrorism, promotes cybersecurity, conducts peacekeeping operations, and has responded to emerging threats such as hybrid warfare and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Though all of its members, apart from the US and Canada, are European, NATO's reach extends far beyond Europe and North America. So it's engaged in military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and the Balkans. And that's what we're going to have a look at. Is it actually outdated? Has it gone beyond its original purpose? Is one of the key debates. It's far more than a Cold War relic today, though. It's a dynamic organisation that really plays a key role in global politics and remains a cornerstone of the defence strategy of the West, of the United States, and particularly of Western Europe. Okay, so we're going to have a look now at the development of NATO over time, and of course we need to start at NATO during the Cold War. So its primary purpose, of course, during the Cold War, it's why it was founded, was to serve as a deterrent to the Soviet Union and the spread of communism in Europe. The geopolitical landscape of the time of the world was defined by a rivalry between the Western Bloc, led by the United States and NATO, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies, which is effectively the Soviet Union's corollary of NATO. And NATO played a crucial role in maintaining Western security and promoting collective defence of its member states during this period. So its key aims, first of all, were to contain the Soviet Union, prevent it expanding into Western Europe. It's really this kind of key strategy of containment, seeking to limit it through military and political means. Collective defence, of course, was central. So an attack on one NATO member would be considered an attack on all members, and that was, of course, really intended to be a deterrent against an attack on any one member and to guarantee the security of Western European nations. And it also adopted a strategy of nuclear deterrence, primarily through the US's nuclear arsenal, but also the nuclear arsenal of the United Kingdom, to counterbalance the Soviet Union's military advance in Europe. And this led to the deployment of US nuclear weapons on European soil beginning in the 1950s. And its strategic doctrine during much of the Cold War was flexible response. This means that it would respond to any Soviet aggression with an appropriate level of force, including the possible use of nuclear weapons if conventional forces were insufficient. And this was really intended to prevent the Soviet Union from believing it could wage a limited war in Europe without risking a nuclear conflict. Okay, so that was the key role it played during the Cold War. Ultimately, it was successful during the Cold War in preventing any Soviet direct military aggression against or intervention against Western European members, and ultimately the US can be seen as winning the Cold War in the end, as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But then what happens after the collapse of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because that really was, up until then, the central aim and kind of founding the reason for NATO. So it was originally formed to counterbalance Soviet power and communism. It had to really redefine its purpose and objectives in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape after the end of the Cold War, and it led to an expansion both in its membership and its mission, as it sought to play a broader role in global security. So, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, it no longer faced a clear adversary, and as a result, it began to shift its events towards new priorities such as crisis management and peacekeeping. So you saw the United Nations at the time in the 1990s, especially authorizing a lot of peacekeeping operations. And even when it didn't, NATO often carried out these peacekeeping operations, NATO countries. But even when it didn't, NATO carried out some of its own as well, particularly, for example, in Bosnia. It also sought to promote stability in Eastern Europe. So it was sought to stabilize former communist states and promote democratic governance and market economies in this region, and this was really seen as crucial for ensuring long-term peace. And it sought to build new partnerships and relationships with other countries, including Russia, actually, through initiatives like the Partnership for Peace program launched in 1994, which offered non-member countries the opportunity to cooperate with NATO on security issues. They really sought to grow its influence in global security. Crucially, since the end of the Cold War, the most contentious thing, particularly in relation to Russia, particularly in relation to the old Soviet Union, that NATO's done is it expanded into former Soviet territories. So it was the first wave of expansion in 1999, when it admitted Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, making it the first time NATO expanded into former Soviet-aligned territories. And this was seen as part of NATO's broader strategy to promote stability and security in Central Europe, but also triggered concerns in Russia, which viewed it as a threat to its sphere of influence, particularly as it was getting close to Ukraine, for example, which borders Russia. You then had the second wave of expansion in 2004, where it added 7 new members, which actually did bring NATO directly to Russia's borders, particularly with the inclusion of the Baltic states, which had been part of the Soviet Union. And for many of these countries, joining NATO was a way to ensure security against potential Western aggression, particularly as by 2000, you start to see Russia kind of growing in power a little bit and assertiveness again. The expansion of NATO was controversial, particularly in Russia, where it was seen as a provocative move. Russian leaders, including Vladimir Putin, viewed NATO's eastward expansion as a direct threat to Russian security, and its offer of potential future membership to Ukraine and Georgia at the 2008 Bucharest summit further heightened tensions with Russia, contributing actually to the Russia-Georgia war later that year. Also, following the Cold War in the 1990s, it carried out new missions, particularly in the Balkans, where it sought to take a more active role in international crises. So its first major military engagement ever came during the Bosnian War, part of the wider Yugoslav wars in the early 1990s. And after years of ethnic violence, it launched Operation Deliberate Force in 1995 to protect civilians and force warring parties to negotiate. It's really significant because it was its first ever military intervention outside its member states, and airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces helped to bring the conflict to an end and secure peace in the region. It intervened again in 1999 in Kosovo to prevent ethnic cleansing by Serbian forces against Kosovo Albanians, and the air campaign was controversial because it did do a lot of damage, but ultimately led to the withdrawal of Serbian forces from Kosovo. And this demonstrated NATO's willingness to act on humanitarian grounds and be an active security and military actor in the world. Okay, so let's go on now into the early 2000s, where it was really adapted to global terrorism and new security threats. So really what dominated global politics, particularly in the early 2000s, was the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror from the United States and the United Kingdom, who are, of course, probably the two most powerful, particularly militarily, members of NATO. So it began to adapt to new global security environment shaped by 9/11, and crucially invoked Article 5 for the first time. In response to 9/11, which declared an attack on the United States, and it was therefore seen as an attack on all, and this led to NATO's involvement in the war on terror, particularly in Afghanistan. And so it took command of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan in 2003, and its mission was to stabilize Afghanistan and rebuild its institutions and train Afghan security forces. And this was crucial because it was NATO's first major mission outside of Europe, and demonstrated it had a growing role after the collapse of the Soviet Union in addressing global security challenges across the world. It also adapted its strategy to include a broader focus on counterterrorism. It created the NATO Response Force in 2002, which kind of sought to make sure that NATO was ready to respond to rapidly emerging threats such as terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So that was the 1990s and early 2000s. in the 2010s then was a decade of both continuity and change and challenge for NATO. The alliance had to navigate what was a really increasingly complex and difficult global security environment, with rising tensions and rising power again of Russia. Internal disagreements over burden sharing, particularly after Trump was elected president. So at the 2010 Lisbon Summit, at the start of the century, NATO adopted a new strategic concept that emphasised collective defence, crisis management and cooperative security. And this reflected NATO's need to address a broader range of security threats in the 21st century, from terrorism to cyber attacks, while still maintaining its core focus on collective defence. A key point in the 2010s, a key event, was the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, which fundamentally changed the security landscape in Europe. So in February 2014, following the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, Russian forces moved into Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, and Russia formally annexed the region through a disputed referendum. And this was the first time since World War II that European borders were being redrawn by force. NATO strongly condemned Russia's actions, declaring the annexation of Crimea illegal. And in response, NATO increased its military presence in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Baltic states and Poland, through the Enhanced Forward Presence Initiative. Of course, it's crucial to understand that Ukraine wasn't and isn't a member of NATO. This involved stationing multinational battle groups in those countries as a deterrent against further Russian aggression into NATO countries, but also further Russian aggression into Ukraine. It significantly worsened NATO-Russia relations as well, as NATO suspended all practical cooperation with Russia through the NATO-Russia Council, marking a sharp reversal of the cooperative approach it pursued in the 1990s and early 2000s. And Russia crucially viewed NATO's military build-up near its borders as a threat, leading to further tensions between the two sides. And the other key thing that happened during the 2010s was Trump raising the issue of burden sharing. So, and this really came to a head under Trump. Obama had raised it previously, but it's effectively the question of how much each NATO member was contributing to its defence spending. This is a long-standing issue, particularly just because the United States spends so much more on defence than any other country. And it felt like it was effectively doing the defence spending for the whole of Western Europe, which in reality it really had been doing since World War II. One of actually the reasons why a lot of Western European countries have quite good welfare systems is they've spent less on defence than a lot of other countries in the last 60, 70 years. And a lot of that was because it's been supplemented by the United States, which have been guaranteeing its security. So throughout his campaign, his presidency, Trump criticised NATO members, particularly European allies such as France, Germany and the United Kingdom, for not meeting their defence spending commitments. He argued that many NATO countries were not contributing their fair share, particularly as they weren't meeting the goal of spending 2% of GDP on defence, as was agreed at the 2014 NATO summit in Wales. Trump also labelled NATO as obsolete during his 2016 presidential campaign, raising real concerns in Western Europe about the US commitment to the alliance. He did later clarify NATO was no longer obsolete, but it really has created uncertainty about the future of US leadership within NATO, particularly as he now has a second term. Crucially, Trump was successful. His criticism did lead to some shifts in defence spending among NATO members. By 2019, more member states had increased their defence budgets, with 9 countries meeting or exceeding the 2% target. But burden sharing did remain a contentious issue throughout the decade, with several European nations still falling short of the target, and the United States still being the big threat of the United States pulling back on its defence spending with Trump's America First nationalist rhetoric. And of course, from the beginning of the Trump presidency through actually to Biden's presidency as well, and we assume very much now into Trump's second presidency, NATO was also challenged by the fact that the US no longer saw Russia as the key strategic rival, which Hillary Clinton had, which Obama had largely had until his second term, really. Instead, China was seen by the whole US political establishment and is today as the key strategic rival rather than Russia. And this really threatens the US's commitment to defending NATO's member states in Europe, as if it's spending so much attention, and this was obviously before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but it's spending so much attention and money on that, they can potentially see that as a distraction against the key geopolitical conflict and competition that's happening in the 21st century, which they see as between the United States and China. The 2020s have really been a defining period for NATO, and a really key period as it adapts to the largest land conflict in Europe since World War II. And that is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that was the most consequential event for NATO in decades. It's drastically altered the European security landscape and led to a renewed focus on NATO's core mission of collective defence. Putin justified the invasion in part by accusing NATO of expanding too close to Russia's borders since the end of the Cold War, which he argues threatened Russian security. So Putin pointed to NATO's expansion into former Soviet states like Baltic countries and its growing relationship with Ukraine in particular, which had sought NATO membership. And he saw those as provocations to Russian security. And he cited NATO's enlargement as a key reason for the invasion, describing it as part of a broader Western encirclement of Russia. Crucially, there was an immediate NATO response. So when Russia launched its invasion, NATO condemned the attack as a violation of international law and European security. While Ukraine is not a NATO member and therefore not covered by NATO's Article 5 collective defence guarantee, the alliance provided substantial military, financial and humanitarian support to Ukraine. And since 2022, the US and NATO members have supplied financial support, advanced weapon systems, intelligence and logistical support to help Ukraine resist Russian forces. NATO also bolsters its military presence on its eastern flank, sending troops, equipment and air defence to Poland, Romania and the Baltic states, which borders Russia and Ukraine, to deter any potential spillover of the conflict into NATO territory. And it really affirmed its central mission of collective defence and really refocused the attention of NATO on Europe again, after it, in the 2000s, been doing a lot in Afghanistan and other parts of the world as well. So member states reaffirmed their commitment to Article 5 and further strengthen NATO's military readiness. And this is especially consequential in the context of the United States, as it had been increasingly focusing on China as the main strategic competitor prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And the invasion of Ukraine once again showed that it needed to focus on Russia as well, as a key threat to peace in Europe, and really showed Eastern Europe as a highly important geopolitical arena. Another really important consequence was that Finland, which borders Russia, and Sweden joined the alliance. So they ultimately saw it as a threat, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also as an opportunity to join NATO, which they'd been wanting to do. A lot of the political class in Finland and Sweden for a long time. So Finland officially joined in April 2023, marking a historic shift in its defence policy. So it shares a long border with Russia and have maintained neutrality throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War era. But the invasion of Ukraine raised fears of potential Russian aggression, and it ultimately wanted the protection of NATO's collective defence. And then Sweden followed in 2024, which had also been a long-standing neutral country, driven by similar fears of Russian aggression as Finland. The accession of Finland and Sweden represents a significant expansion of NATO, bringing two highly capable military forces into the alliance, and Finland in particular enhances NATO's capacity to defend its north and eastern flanks, giving it strategic location along the Russian border, which has further isolated Russia, but also further heightened tensions between Russia and NATO. And of course, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's also been kind of forced increased military spending, particularly from countries which Trump had accused for free riding for years, especially Germany, which underwent pretty much overnight a significant transformation in its defence strategy. So for decades, it maintained a restrained military posture, spending less than the NATO target of 2% of GDP on defence, and focusing on diplomacy and economic power, also actually getting a lot of energy in natural gas from Russia. But in response to the invasion, Olaf Scholz announced a historic turning point in German defence policy, pledging to inject 100 billion into its defence budget and committed to meeting NATO's 2% defence spending target. So it's a really big departure from its previous stance. Poland, again, significantly bolstered its defence spending, committing to reaching 3% of GDP by 2023, whilst embarking on a large-scale military modernisation programme. The final thing we're going to have a look at then are two key debates about NATO, with the first being whether NATO has lost its purpose, and the second being whether NATO is still effective, and they're of course also linked together. So, first looking at the debate over whether NATO has lost its purpose. So since the end of the Cold War, the relevance of NATO has been a real subject as debate. with some arguing that NATO's original purpose of defending Western Europe against Soviet expansion has become obsolete after the collapse of the Soviet Union, raising questions about whether the alliance has lost its direction. On the other hand, proponents argue that NATO has successfully adapted to new global security challenges, and especially that the defence of Europe is as important as it's ever been, which kind of was really bolstered as an argument after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, arguments that NATO has lost its purpose is that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO's primary purpose no longer exists. It leaves NATO without a clear adversary, making its mission much less focused. And as a result, it's failed to maintain a unified strategic mission, particularly with the US increasingly concerned by China as its key strategic competitor. NATO's expansion into former Soviet territories, such as the Baltic states and Poland, has been controversial. Critics argue that it's diluted NATO's core mission, adding members who bring security risks and complicating decision-making processes. And Russia also has cited this expansion of NATO in the early 2000s as a key source of tension, leading to accusations that NATO is actually provoking conflicts rather than preventing it. Further, and crucially I think to this argument, NATO's involvement in conflicts outside its traditional European sphere, such as Afghanistan and Libya, has led to criticism that it's overextending itself by engaging in operations far from its original purpose and central aim of defending Europe. And therefore, the kind of end of the Soviet Union as an immediate danger also arguably contributes to a lack of commitment from European nation states to funding their militaries and consequent disagreements with the United States over burden sharing. And actually there can be seen as a bit of a divergence, particularly in the 2000s and 2010s, between Western Europe especially, and then Eastern Europe and the United States as well. So Eastern Europe continues to see Russia as the primary threat, the most important threat especially to them, whilst Western Europe and the US are focused more on terrorism and China as a major geopolitical threat. And this kind of divergence in interests complicates NATO's ability to act coherently. On the other hand, it can be argued that NATO hasn't lost its purpose. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine underscored the continued relevance of NATO and the need for a strong collective defence alliance in Europe. NATO's response, including military support to Ukraine and the deployment of troops to its Eastern European members, of course not Ukraine though, demonstrated this continued importance of NATO as an alliance, and how Article 5 as a deterrent is still really, really important to its Eastern European members. It also prompted historically neutral countries to seek NATO membership, highlighting the kind of enduring appeal and importance of NATO's security guarantee. Whilst its original mission may also have been around collective defence, the NATO alliance also can be seen as having successfully actually adapted to modern challenges, rather than kind of being drawn away from its original purpose. It's taken on important roles in combating terrorism, conducting peacekeeping missions, and responding to cyber warfare, and can therefore be seen as having adapted to an ever-changing security landscape and an ever-changing global politics. And it's also expanding its influence beyond Europe through partnerships with non-member countries and international organisations, including with Japan, Australia, and South Korea, which allow NATO to play a key role in maintaining global stability and addressing emerging threats. The geopolitics may have changed, but it can be argued that NATO remains central as a global security actor. The next key debate then is whether NATO is effective. So first, looking at some arguments that NATO is effective. And that first one is that collective defence has ultimately been successful in preventing Russian aggression against NATO. So its core principle of collective defence enshrined in Article 5 has been successful in preventing any aggression from first the Soviet Union and now Russia against its member state, neither of which have taken military action against a NATO member state since they entered the alliance. Its commitment to protect member states has been shown since the invasion of Ukraine, as it's kind of enhanced its military presence in countries such as the Baltic states and Poland. Whilst its ability to respond rapidly to the Ukraine crisis and bolster its eastern defence is a clear example of its relevance and effectiveness in ensuring European security. And this effectiveness and importance to its member states can be seen in the fact that it was a really attractive joining NATO for Finland and Sweden, which joined in 2023 and 2024 respectively. NATO, it can also be argued that NATO has been really successful in tackling modern threats in the post-Cold War era and really adapting to new threats. So it's adapted its mission beyond traditional state-on-state conflict to address emerging security threats that define the 21st century. So it's not just threats from other states, it's now terrorism, hybrid warfare and cyber attacks, including from states but also non-state actors. And following 9/11, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time and showcased its ability to lead global counter-terrorism efforts in Afghanistan. Further, in the realm of cyber defence, it's developed comprehensive strategies to protect its members from cyber attacks, which has become a significant component of modern warfare. And finally, it can be argued that NATO is effective because it's helped to promote peace around the world. Not only in Bosnia and Kosovo, in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, where it prevented large-scale conflicts from spiralling further, but also in Libya, actually, and by assisting post-conflict reconstruction and humanitarian relief efforts in a number of countries in the world. Whilst it's also collaborated with non-member countries, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea, therefore maintaining a really key role in promoting global security and peace. On the other hand, finally, we've got some arguments that NATO is ineffective. First of all, it's failed to prevent Russian aggression in Europe. Yes, it wasn't against one of its members, but Russia has resurged as a power, become more aggressive again, and acted militarily against a European state. And therefore, critics argue that NATO has failed to prevent Russian aggression in its immediate neighbourhood. It annexed Crimea in 2014, which should have been a significant warning, but it then was able to invade Ukraine again in 2022, highlighting NATO's limitations in stopping non-member states from being attacked. Further, Putin actually justified his invasion as being caused by NATO and the fact that they expanded too close to Russia's borders since the end of the Cold War. Further, Russia's continued interference in Eastern Europe, including its support for separatist movements and cyber attacks on NATO members like Estonia, raises questions about NATO's ability to deter hybrid threats. Secondly, it can be argued that NATO is no longer effective as there's a lack of shared vision and commitment to NATO among its members, particularly since it's grown in membership to over 30 members, which has led to a lack of coherent strategic vision. So Eastern European nations have continued to focus on the central threat from Russia, as we spoke about earlier. But Western European members and the US are now more focused on issues like terrorism, and particularly more focused on China as a key strategic competitor. Further, the alliance appeared divided and weak due to the issue of burden sharing, which became a particularly high-profile issue under the presidency of Donald Trump, who openly criticised NATO as obsolete and questioned the US's continued commitment to the alliance if European nations did not continue to increase their defence budgets, which is a real threat to NATO with Trump's second term. So though many European countries did increase their defence spending and have since the invasion of Ukraine, the US still bears a disproportionately large share of the alliance military expenditure, and another Trump presidency potentially threatens the future of the alliance, which is highly dependent on America. You can also add to this kind of lack of shared vision. Also, Turkey is really key actually to this. So Turkey is a NATO member state, and if you look at Syria, the United States and Turkey have actually been in many ways backing different rebel groups in Syria for over 5-10 years now, and that has led to significant tensions between the two countries. And actually, with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, that could potentially become a much bigger story and demonstrate. So Turkey was kind of described by Emmanuel Macron as a reason for the brain death of NATO in I think it was an Economist interview a few years ago, and so that could really actually be another key point of tension within the alliance. And finally, NATO can be argued to be ineffective as it can be seen as having overextended beyond its original mandate. So critics argue that NATO's role has expanded far too far beyond its original purpose of providing collective defence to Europe and become ineffective as a result. Its interventions in places like Afghanistan and Libya have drawn criticism, with some viewing them as outside the alliance's core mission, whilst especially the long and costly mission in Afghanistan, which ultimately failed with the Taliban regaining control in 2021, is seen by many as a failure of NATO's capacity to manage non-conventional conflicts. Additionally, this global reach has raised questions about its strategic focus. By taking on a wider range of roles, including crisis management, counterterrorism, cyber defence, critics contend that NATO risks diluting its effectiveness. And some argue that actually this lack of focus and clear message contributed to Putin's willingness and ability to invade Ukraine in 2022. So yeah, that was everything you need to know about NATO in A Level Politics. As I said at the start, some of the key questions you could get asked, you could get questions just on NATO, whether it's now ineffective and outdated, and you can use a lot of those arguments we went through at the end of the video. You can also often get asked in terms of, it could be included in the 30 marker with the United Nations. So you might do 2 paragraphs on the United Nations, 1 on NATO, for example, if it's a question about how effective political global governance is. But you could also be asked to compare it to another institution. The United Nations probably the most likely one in a 12 marker, whether looking at the similarities in the criticisms, or potentially the differences. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.